Good morning. This is a little bit awkward, but I'm so glad to be with you. And my voice sounds like it often does in the spring with my spring allergies, but I'm okay, I promise. So I come to you this morning speaking in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I would say, please be seated because that's normally what I do, but I suspect you already are. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. This is the beginning of the beginning of the book of Genesis. It's a beginning. And it's where we find ourselves this morning. Not only because this beginning of the beginning is the assigned Hebrew Bible text for this morning, Trinity Sunday, but also because it is where we find ourselves as a country, as a community, and as a church. We are finding ourselves in these deep, primordial chaos waters, where it is dark, where we are being swamped by waves, and sometimes literally struggling to breathe. I'm sure you can imagine that this week I have received a good number of emails or phone calls or angry posts on social media asking why I got political, why I'm being divisive instead of loving. You may have wondered these things yourself. And I really don't mean to sound at all snarky about my answer. But the answer is really clear to me. The answer for why I was there, for why I spoke out, for why I said what I said, is bedrock clear to me. It's because of the Bible. And frankly, this week's texts alone answer all of this. So let's take a look. So this first book of Genesis, the first story of creation that begins the way I just read, where we are in chaos waters and the breath of God, the ruach of God, sweeps across those chaos waters, is the first creation story in the book of Genesis. And let me read part of it to you. I know you know this, but the words are so beautiful. It starts at verse 27. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And at the end of the paragraph, it says, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. God created every human being in God's own image. Every single one of us carries that image of God with us. Every single human being that has ever lived and that ever will. From everyone at the protests to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. Every human being was made in the image of God. That's what brought me to that patio. That's what brings the protesters. That's what brings, thankfully, the church to come and stand up for people made in the image of God, our brothers and sisters who have been brutalized and oppressed, and whose voices have been suppressed and diminished for centuries. It's because of the Bible, not a political belief, not a political ideology, but because it is right here in the beginning. Every one of us is made in the image of God, and we are good, and we are loved. And that's enough. So what do we do about that? That brings us to our second reading for today. Our gospel reading for today is from the very end of the Gospel of Matthew. It's called the Great Commission, although of course it doesn't have that title in the Bible, but we call it the Great Commission. It's Matthew 28. I'm going to read starting at verse 19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. So what did Jesus command us? To love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength, and let me add courage. And to love our neighbor as ourselves. Now you know from the story of the Good Samaritan, who is the neighbor? The neighbor is the one who cares for the vulnerable. The neighbor was the Samaritan, the outcast, who showed love. So what else did Jesus command us? So in the Gospel of John, Jesus particularly uses this language of commandment this way. This is the Gospel of John, chapter 13, starting at verse 34. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So, love one another just as I have loved you is something Jesus called a commandment, which then is also something that we are told to teach. And how did Jesus love? Looking at the stories of Jesus' life, how did Jesus love? By tending to the sick, by healing people, by casting out demons, by bringing people who are on the margins back into community, by laying his hands on them, by speaking the truth to them when they didn't want to hear it, by showing up, by loving them with his whole life. That's what love looks like from Jesus, when Jesus tells us to love one another. And I hadn't thought about it until I read it this week, but when Jesus says that by this kind of love, by healing and touching and showing up and casting out demons and bringing people in from the margins, that's how the world will know that we are his disciples? By that? Not by the sign outside that says we are his disciples, or the t-shirt we wear, or the cross we wear, or the collar I wear, or the sign we put up outside that calls us a church. Jesus says, by this, by loving one another as I have loved you. That's how the world will know we are his disciples. And part of my outrage last week in my sermon about how the church hasn't stood up for something worthy of the Holy Spirit was about this. We've been relying on the sign outside our church, or the label we give ourselves, or the cross we wear, or the vows we take to speak for us. And we haven't paid attention to our actions that show that we are disciples by how it is that we love like Jesus loved. I want us to go back to the beginning of the beginning again, ironically, for the end of my sermon. And aren't you glad we're not in person? Because I'm sure the sermon would be a heck of a lot longer. So I want us to go back to the beginning of the beginning because there's something I want you to notice. When we find ourselves in these chaos waters, in this dark, primordial deep, which is what the Hebrew means, when we find ourselves in those chaos waters, it is dark. How do I know it's dark? Because it's not until verse 14 that light comes. What I want us to notice is this. God is at work in the dark. In fact, God is present in the dark. There is no darkness where God is not present and working. Not the primordial darkness of the deep sin of racism or the use of power to oppress innocent people. God is in every place of darkness. God is at work there. There is no place where God is not. The chaos waters are scary. There is no question of that. We don't know what's happening. The waves are swamping us. The deep is very deep, and it's ancient. And those serpents that are in the deep are terrifying, and we know they are in those primordial waters with us. But God is at work there, sweeping over those chaos waters with God's own breath, with God's own ruah, spirit. God is at work. And we also don't need to be afraid, because turning back to the end of the gospel for this morning, we hear this from Jesus. And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus is here for this. Jesus is here for us in these primordial chaos waters, feeling the wind of the Holy Spirit creeping across the chaos waters as God is at work in them and Jesus is with us. It is scary, for sure, but there is nothing to fear. Don't be afraid. Amen.